High hopes. Jack, we've got no choice. You'll have to take the old cow to Stockland and see what you can get for her. With his aging mother's words ringing in his ears, Jack put a rope round old Bessie's neck and set off for Stockland. It was a long way from King's Stoke, but he knew that if he just followed the banks of the Mead, then he'd get there eventually. But then, towards the end of the first day, he met a strange fellow sitting by the side of the river. The oddbody stood no taller than a pig, but he had an enormous straw hat that sat on his head and reached as high as Jack's shoulder.
"Hello, Jack. I've been waiting for you,"
the creature said, in a voice that crackled like sparks from a wet fire. Jack knew better than to talk to his kind, so he waved the reed ripper away, but they refused to leave.
"I'll buy your cow from you in return for this hat full of magic beans,"
it persisted, and whipped off the hat to show Jack that it was full of hundreds of small beans. Each bean was the size of Jack's little finger, and every one a different colour to the last. "What use have I for magic beans?" demanded Jack. But even as said it, he couldn't help but think of how far it was to Stockland. If he sold the cow now, then he could take the magic beans and still be home well before dawn.
"These are not just any magic beans,"
claimed the picklefoot and grinned, revealing a mouthful of wide teeth.
"These beans are made of mulchweed. If you plant them, they will grow."
Quick-Tongue yawned as they stretched sleepily. "What's a picklefoot?" they asked sleepily. Swiftfisher smiled at her sister, even as she closed the book. "Time for sleep. I'll read you some more tomorrow. You might find out then." "What do magic beans do?" Quick-Tongue shot back, grasping for a few more minutes. "They grow into something extraordinary. That's why they're magic. Now, go to sleep." Overview. Last season, the Imperial Senate passed a motion to establish the cattle markets in Stockland and Wayford. This followed a proposal put forward by Marcher farmers who travelled to Marive to set up the southern herd in Nadir in order to alleviate the arid nature of the region. Following the winter solstice, dozens of farm owners across the marches opted to drive their cattle to market, receiving cattle bonds rather than their usual production. At the start of the spring equinox, there are expected to be 818 bonds available to trade, barter, or gift on the field of Anvil. Enterprising Thule merchants have already made clear they intend to visit the Marcher camp on the first night of the summit to trade mana crystal for cattle bonds. The original motion to establish the cattle markets also created the title of Shepherd of the Southern Herd, an Imperial Orc position whose income is dependent on how many cattle bonds that nation are able to acquire. Elsewhere, the Domiro of Afar can further expand their herd and hopefully see returns within around 5 years. Likewise, the ambassador to the Iron Confederacy can trade cattle bonds to the Serani for ingots and more. Some cunning Suak have a plan to use a herd of cattle to rid their territory of a terrible beast of the Hawklord, and an Eternal has displayed an interest in acquiring cattle. A visitor from the City of Chains is planning to visit to auction off some warm ashes in exchange for cattle bonds. Finally, the farmers in Stockland and Wayford themselves are looking for cattle, whether for immediate returns or as breeding stock. The price for cattle bonds in either market has a minimum and a maximum, and the final price available will depend on how many heads of cattle are confirmed for sale at the markets. The fewer cattle are sold in the local market, the higher the price each will be worth. Any wains unaccounted for after the summit, that is, left unsold to any of the buyers, will be discounted and assumed lost. The cattle will be sold to the highest bidder, and the money spent on the continuous improvement of both cattle markets, and go towards funding summer fetes in both towns. The Southern Herd. The Southern Herd can be established using a minimum of 240 cattle bonds. The seasonal income of the Shepherd of the Southern Herd will increase if more cattle bonds are provided. The original plan that spurred on the Great Beef Market of 87 was to establish a great herd in Marive, sibling to the one tended by the Shepherd of the Great Herd. The greatest desire for heads of cattle lies in Nadir, the northeastern region of the Imperial Orcs' second territory. The pitch is fairly simple to express, if difficult to arrange. A minimum of 240 cattle need to be transported to Nadir, at which point they will form the core of a new great herd, and that will be enough that the local flora and fauna adapt, removing the arid nature of the region. The difficulty comes in both acquiring enough cattle and in transporting them across the Empire. Marcher and Imperial Orc military units would be needed to escort the drovers, at least 1,000 strength each season, first from the marches to Bastion and Necropolis, then the last leg to Mariv. There will no doubt be difficulty on the journey, but as Alan of Hay points out, you can't drove a herd without getting sore calves. But first, it is for the Imperial Orcs who attend Anvil to purchase, haggle and exchange for sufficient cattle bonds to establish the southern herd. OOC note. We will assume that every cattle bond in the inventory of an Imperial Orc character is intended to contribute towards the southern herd. If the attempt is successful, we will include a list of the names of every character who contributed in order of those who've donated the most. If 240 cattle bonds are acquired, the seasonal income will be 560 rings. If 330 cattle bonds are acquired, it will be a seasonal income of 848 rings. If 420 cattle bonds are acquired, the seasonal income will be 1,184 rings. If 510 cattle bonds are acquired, 1,568 rings will be the seasonal income. 600 cattle bonds will result in a seasonal income of 2,000 rings. Herds of Afar. The Domiro of Afar can increase the size of their herd using cattle bonds. If the Domiro can acquire 100 bonds, it will increase the income from their sinecure by 250 rings a season. Last season, the Imperial Senate voted to re-establish the Herds of Afar. While the option was available to use cattle bonds, it was funded in coin by the newly elected senator for Faraz, Garviel y Abrera y Regio. But why settle for a newly rejuvenated herd when it could be further expanded? The drovers and guards are certain they would be able to manage if the herd were to increase by half again, another 100 heads of cattle. If the Domiro of Afar can acquire 100 bonds, they will be able to further increase the size of their sinecure, increasing its seasonal income. OOC note. If the Domiro of Afar has 100 cattle bonds in their inventory after the event, then we will assume they are intended for the expansion of the Herds of Afar. If there are fewer than 100 cattle bonds, then they will be exchanged at a rate of 18 rings for each cattle bond. Surani Herds. The Baron de Hauteville has expressed interest in purchasing cattle bonds from the ambassador to the Iron Confederacy. The Baron will pay 50 marrowort and 50 crowns for the first 50 cattle bonds. The Baron will pay an additional 75 ingots of green iron for an additional 50 cattle bonds. One of the buyers of cattle from the Domiro of Afar is the Baron de Hauteville of northern Arbonne. An offhand remark in Afar to the Surani traders led to a quick and animated discussion between the two Naga representatives. A few weeks later, a messenger arrived with a personal letter from the Baron, laying out a request for either 50 or 100 heads of cattle. The letter names the price he's willing to pay, and makes assurances that this will not affect the ongoing purchase of cattle from the Domiro of Afar, but goes no further on the reason. The messenger, a rangy, youthful briar, gave more context to the sudden interest. There are reports of a blight in one of the duchies to the southwest. It is expected to be resolved fairly quickly, but the Baron is a discerning man, and a chance to demonstrate his value to the southwestern duke might come in useful for the future. OOC note. If the ambassador to the Iron Confederacy has 50 or 100 cattle bonds in their inventory after the event, then we'll assume they are intended for trade to the Baron de Hauteville. If there are fewer than 50, then they will be exchanged at a rate of 18 rings for each cattle bond. If there are not enough green iron trade, then they will also be exchanged at a rate of 18 rings for each cattle bond. Cows in a swamp. A sandfisher is offered 16 drams of realms root for 12 cattle bonds. The request has been delivered to the merchant prince of Misericord Market. The sandfishers have also made an offer for some of the cattle bonds, one of their traders having heard of the availability of cows in the Misericord Market. Frost Eyes, a youth with impressive plans on Zir's own herd, has managed to convince enough other sandfishers of the merit of Zir's plan, and has sent a trade offer to Yona Yakovich, merchant prince of Misericord Market. Z wants 12 cattle bonds and can pay 16 drams of realm root for them. If the merchant prince of the Misericord Market has 12 cattle bonds in their inventory after the event, then we will assume they are intended for trade with Frost Eyes. If there are fewer than 12 cattle bonds, then they will be exchanged at a rate of 18 rings for each cattle bond. Beast in the Winds. Sufficient cattle could be used to lure a guardian of Hayak into a trap in the Suak wastes. The banner-bearer of Atconarok can use 100 cattle bonds to create a chance to rid Sir Masuak of one of the monstrous beasts of Hayak. Far to the north, in the wastes of Sir Masuak, the endless tundra is haunted by the beasts of Hayek. 2.5 years ago, the brother of lions unleashed his fury against the Thule. Scores of his followers, creatures of ferocity, vengeance, and wrath, flooded the territory and hunted its inhabitants. Joined later by the foul monsters of Aggermont, these beasts of Hayek have been kept in check by heroic winterfolk and glorious Daunish hunting the Suak wastes since the Hall of the Hunters was constructed. One creature of Hayek has caused more havoc than any other, always too careful, too wily to be trapped. Typhon is a dangerous beast of the summer realm, a guardian capable of tracking the scent of its master's quarry long after the trail has run cold. Drawn into the mortal realm by the efforts of the Jotun, it now hunts freely, stalking the Suak and savaging the great mammoth herds. If 100 head of cattle can be brought to Semmer Suak, then they could lure Typhon into a trap. That would be enough to present a chance to slay the great beast. While it won't be enough on its own to rid Semmer Suak of the dangerous heralds of Hayek, it will certainly help and will continue the efforts of the past 2 years in safeguarding the Suak from this threat. OOC note: if the banner-bearer of Atconarac has 100 cattle bonds in their inventory after the event, then we will assume they were intended for luring Typhon. If there are fewer than 100 cattle bonds, then they will be exchanged at a rate of 18 rings for each cattle bond. The markets. The cattle markets of Stockland and Wayford have seen an unprecedented amount of business. There are expected to be 484 Stockland bonds and 334 Wayford bonds in Anvil at the summit. Any Marcher farm owner can put cattle bonds in their hand-in packs to sell them at the markets. The price for each cattle bond will depend on which market they are for and the total amount sold in that market. Ultimately, some farmers might opt to sell their cattle at the markets back in Upwold and Mitwold. The minimum that any cattle bond would sell for, regardless of how many were sold at the market, is 18 rings, while the most is 54 rings. Each of the two markets has different rates. The total bonds sold in each market will affect the value of each bond.